I want to welcome you again. Good evening, and thanks so much for joining us for the first Ask the Doctors Town Hall of the spring semester. I want to give a special warm welcome to all of our returning students, and I hope the snow didn't slow you down today. My name is Rebecca Brown. I'm Vice Chancellor, Chief of Staff, and Secretary to the Board. And our medical experts here tonight are Dr. Steve Lawrence and Dr. Cherie LeBlanc, and they're going to be answering some of your questions on COVID-19. We have a lot of information to get through tonight, so I'm going to get started with some introductions right now. Dr. Lawrence is Associate Professor of Medicine in the Division of Infectious Diseases at the School of Medicine and Assistant Dean of Curriculum for Clinical Sciences in the Office of Medical Student Education. And Dr. LeBlanc is Executive Director of the Health and Wellness Center on the Danforth campus and Assistant Professor of the Department of Medicine. We're so grateful to both of you for making time for this town hall and for all of you who have been able to join us this evening. I'm going to get started by asking the doctors to share the latest information on COVID-19 in St. Louis and on our campus. And then we'll go ahead and start taking some of your questions. You can type those questions into the Q&A box, and we'll also have some pre-submitted questions. And thank you all for pre-submitting those in advance of this meeting. It helps us get things together. You'll see in the chat, we also have a few people on call behind the scenes to answer the questions that you're writing. And so we're going to try to get to as many questions as possible from, it looks like, about 180 of you that are on the call now. So let's get started. I want to start by asking Drs. Lawrence and LeBlanc for any updates on what's happening with COVID-19 in the St. Louis region and here on campus. Dr. Lawrence, what's the latest in the St. Louis region?
Yes, good evening, everybody. And also, I would just want to mention that we might hear a little bit of noise in the background. This is life in the pandemic as we're trying to do 2 or 3 things at the same time. So St. Louis is actually at the moment doing relatively well compared to some parts of the country, but also compared to where we were just a month or 6 weeks ago. Just like most of the country, we did experience a large peak of activity in December. And then we have had, with the exception of a little blip that occurred 2 weeks after Christmas and New Year's, which was predicted and completely expected, there has been now a steady decline for the last 2.5 weeks in all of the metrics that we follow, particularly just the transmission rates themselves, the reproduction number, which has been below 1 now for over a week straight, and then also the test positivity rate. These combined paint a picture that we're in a downslope phase. There is still moderately high levels of transmission, so that doesn't mean that we sit back and say, oh, we're done. We do still have to remain vigilant, but it does also mean that we're moving in the right direction right now.
Dr. LeBlanc, what can you tell us about what's happening on the Danforth campus?
Thanks, Rebecca, and good evening, everyone. Well, we're close to completing our spring entry testing, and at this moment, we've just had 15 positives out of over 5,000 student tests, giving us a really low positivity rate, and we have just 18 students quarantining currently as well. What I'd like to say, though, is even though the positivity rate from our entry testing is really quite low, and we're pleased with that, it is higher than it was in the fall. And given the scene nationally, as well as the number of students who've called into Habif to let us know they've tested positive while home on break, we've decided to do another full round of testing next week with our undergraduate population. This way, we hope to catch any students who may have been in that incubation phase during the first test and may not have had enough virus there to test positive. We hope to catch them early, which is always our goal. Hopefully then can isolate them and quarantine any contacts. We then plan to go back to our regular surveillance testing throughout the semester, and that's going to start again on the 8th. We'll be watching, as we always do, the positivity rate pretty carefully on campus as well as in our community, and feel that our testing plan gives us adaptability and flexibility. So we will be, shifting our priorities based on the data in real time. The only other thing I'd like to say before we start is Dr. Lawrence and I reviewed some of the pre-submitted questions, and all really great questions, and really, in my opinion, deserving the expertise of our infectious disease physician here on the call. So I'm going to have Dr. Lawrence take the lead on many of these questions, and we'll tag team and jump in where I feel my experience is most useful. Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Dr. LeBlanc. So we're going to move into the questions. I'm going to start with some of the pre-submitted ones here while I wait for some things to populate in the chat. And the first one is for Dr. LeBlanc. Who is currently eligible to get the vaccine, and does the university plan to offer the vaccine to faculty, staff, and students?
Thanks. Well, I'd like to first say that it's really each state is who controls the access and determines the eligibility for vaccines. And Missouri right now is currently in what we call phase 1 of the vaccine rollout. And they've also the state has decided that the distribution of the vaccine is going to occur really through our 4 major health care systems in the state, as well as the local departments of health. So right now in phase 1, phase 1A means healthcare workers and those in long facilities, and most of those people have been vaccinated, at least with their first and many with their second dose as well. Phase 1B, it gets a little complicated, but phase 1B is 3-tiered, and tier 1 includes first responders and other essential workers during an emergency, and those people are currently being immunized. Tier 2 on this includes also those who are over the age of 65 or are at higher risk of severe disease, and that has been started as well. People in this category are being vaccinated currently. Tier 3 is when we're going to include staff in K-12 schools. And then phase 2 is when staff in higher ed like WashU would be included in the vaccination. And then it goes into phase 3, where all the rest of folks who haven't already been vaccinated will be eligible for vaccine. What I wanted to say is that if WashU were to be given permission to distribute the vaccine, we are prepared to set up max vaccination sites on campus. And again, we still need to follow those criteria that's been by the state. And we hope that we'll be in phase 2 and 3 before the end of the spring semester, but really just need to wait and see how this is all going to roll out. So right now we're encouraging everyone really here on campus to pre-register through our partner hospital, BJC, through their online registration.
Thanks, Dr. LeBlanc. Dr. Lawrence, the next one is for you, and is a bit of follow-up to the vaccine question. This one is, from what I've read, vaccinated individuals can still transmit the virus. Given the fact that faculty and staff are not eligible at this time and students may or may not get vaccinated, how can we expect to protect unvaccinated individuals when we go back to work as usual?
Yeah, so I think the quick answer to that is that we have been in that scenario for the entire fall semester before vaccine was available. You know, the vaccine is a game changer. These vaccines are remarkable. They're some of the best vaccines that have ever been produced to prevent any illness. And they will make a big difference once they're broadly deployed. But in the meantime, we still are going to be dependent on all of the public health mitigation measures that we have put into place and that have been successful at preventing transmission on campus. You know, so all of those measures, including the masking recommendations and requirements, the distancing in classrooms and in other spaces and dining and everywhere in the university settings, certainly the density of people on campus and in these spaces, preventing large gatherings, those really fundamental elements of the mitigation strategy, that each one is a layer when they've been combined and successfully adhered to with high levels like we had seen on our campus over the last semester. Those have shown to be effective at certainly reducing and minimizing the number of cases that do occur. Once vaccine is broadly available, that's even going to knock it down to very likely only very few sporadic cases that eventually will break through, similar to, say, other respiratory viruses during respiratory virus season.
Thanks, Dr. Lawrence. This is another one related to the vaccines, and it relates to the effects. So I'm going to read it here. I'm concerned about the mRNA technology in the vaccine and its possible long-term effects. I keep reading about the minimal side effects, but those are immediate short-term effects. I'm more concerned about years from now. Are there any studies investigating how mRNA manipulation affects the body years after being exposed to it?
Yeah. So first off, the concept sounds kind of scary. It's like RNA and DNA, and it's manipulating genetic material. But the reality is that the RNA, which viruses essentially are just tiny little packets of RNA that have a little coating, like a protein coating around them. And so this vaccine, what it does is it takes that RNA that is essentially the core of the virus and then wraps it in sort of like this fatty envelope of frozen lipids, and then that's injected into our muscle cells. Our muscle cells then take up that RNA, but it doesn't go into the nucleus of our cells or combine or mix with our own DNA, but rather the machinery within those cells then uses that RNA as a script to then create the spike protein, which is what generates an immune response. That RNA then itself degrades relatively quickly and just disappears. It's actually broken down quickly. That's part of the reason why the vaccines are need to be so cold, is because it's very unstable. It doesn't last a long time. It's broken down in the body very quickly. Throughout all the history of vaccines, with which we've got, but there have been many dozens and very successful vaccines over the last several decades, none have been associated with long-term side effects. Long-term side effects from a vaccine really is about in the range of 1 to 3 months. And that is the reason why the FDA required 6 months of safety data before they would even consider giving emergency use authorization for any of these vaccines. So there's really very little anticipation that there would be any long-term effects from vaccines in general, in specifically even with these mRNA ones.
Thanks, Dr. Lawrence. And there's one short follow-up from the chat related to this. Is there any more information about the vaccination for pregnant or breastfeeding women?
Not actual data. Those are not, and part of the reason for that is that there weren't a large number of women who are pregnant or breastfeeding who were part of the trials. And we have believed that there's not an increased risk for this. We haven't seen, since we've now vaccinated about 20 million people in the country, there hasn't yet been at least any evidence that those who have been pregnant when they're vaccinated have had any adverse outcomes. Now, it's a little too early to say with 100% certainty, but there's not a reason to believe that. And I should just quickly address that there's sort of a disinformation that has been somewhat circulated that there's a kind of protein in the placenta that is also called sort of a spike protein. And so some people have given misinformation that the vaccine would cross-react with it and there could be antibodies against the placenta. The so-called spike protein in the placenta is in no way, shape, or form related or structurally similar to the spike protein on the coronavirus. And so there's no mechanistic reason why that could even be possible.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Lawrence. Dr. LeBlanc, this one I'm going to toss to you, and it relates to public health on the Danforth campus in relation to the vaccine. The question is, it's understood that if an individual has received both doses of the vaccine, they would still need to continue to follow guidelines regarding wearing a mask, social distancing, et cetera. However, if they were contact traced, would they still need to quarantine?
So what a great question. We actually reached out to our local Department of Health, too, to see if they might be able to weigh in on this question, because Dr. Lawrence and I saw it a little bit earlier. And we've heard that there are some states that really, I think it's Oregon, if I'm not mistaken, that has decided that if folks have been vaccinated, they've had both their doses and they're several weeks out, that they might not need to quarantine if they're identified as a close contact. Right now, though, here in Missouri, and as far as I know, our local Department of Health, which is St. Louis County, also feels that you really do need to quarantine. That's the short answer. The CDC, I think, does not have enough information to definitively say at this moment that you are protected and wouldn't need a quarantine. And I expect we'll be following their guidelines as well as our St. Louis County guidelines on that.
Understood. Thanks, Dr. LeBlanc. Dr. Lawrence, this one's back to you in regards to the variants. What can you tell us about the new variants of COVID-19 that are now appearing? Should we expect these to make things worse? And is there something we should be doing differently?
Yeah, holy cow, there's been a lot of news about the variants recently, and for good reason, although I want to be able to put them into context. So all respiratory viruses, particularly the RNA respiratory viruses, they change over time as our own cells are being hijacked by viruses to make viral proteins and make new virus particles. That process is a little bit sloppy, and there are mutations that occur in the viral RNA over time. And sometimes those mutations then lead to just randomly, a new changes in the virus that make them more adaptable to humans and more efficient pathogens in humans. This is natural. This is just natural selection. And what has occurred, and again, no surprise, is that through sequencing, there have been identified across the world a few different variants of the virus that have developed some changes in the structure of their spike protein that seem to confer a competitive advantage by making, in some instances with the so-called UK variant, it looks like it's a little bit more contagious. And how can it be more contagious? Well, perhaps it binds a little more strongly to the receptors in our nose when the virus lands in there. And there's some evidence perhaps that it may generate more virus in the person who's infected. So that means that they're shedding more virus and might be more likely to infect other people. Now, the details of how much more contagious it is are still being looked at, but it looks like perhaps maybe 30 to 40% more contagious. A way to think about it is if you've got one person who is sick and has 10 close contacts, which they shouldn't, people shouldn't be having 10 close contacts, period. But if they did, then say on average, maybe 2 or 3 people would be infected now with this new variant. Maybe 3 or 4 people might be infected, using all other things being equal with the same types of mitigation strategies that are being used. And so there is a lot of concern globally that these things are just going to make it a little bit harder to keep things under control, to keep the numbers at a reasonable place. And there's also a real intent to keep a close eye on other variants that could be even a little more serious. For example, there's the South African variant. There's some evidence that says perhaps our immune response to the predominant variants that we've seen for the last 10 months might not give us an immune response that totally protects us versus the South African variant. And maybe the vaccines won't work quite as well against them. So again, this is something that is changing almost every single day. We're getting new information about the significance of these. But one thing that has not yet been demonstrated is that the appearance of these things into a community does not necessarily mean that it's going to suddenly explode and make the numbers much worse. We are watching, and we're certainly concerned about that being a potential outcome. But as of yet, there's not a demonstrated high risk that that's definitely going to happen. So all that being said, that at the moment, we are going to use this as an opportunity to hammer home messages of all of the things that we know work for mitigation, period. And we're also going to be able to, have in place the increased surveillance to be able to determine when these isolates become more abundant. We're going to be watching carefully to see if that equates to higher levels of transmission and higher numbers, which if they do, then those do require ramping up of other mitigation measures. one quick last little note on this is that it's also a race against time, because the UK variant, which seems to be the one most likely to sort of take off, is also susceptible to, or our vaccines should protect against it. And so one of the things, if we can rapidly get enough people vaccinated in the US, there's a reasonable chance that we may be able to sort of quell it before it takes off.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Lawrence. I'm going to move into some questions about testing and the dashboard more specifically. And the next one is for you, Dr. Lawrence. Why is the surveillance testing for undergraduate students still only every 2 weeks? Shouldn't this be happening more frequently, as Dr. Fauci has recommended?
Yeah, so this is a question that certainly has had a lot of attention, and we have had certainly many opportunities to talk about the role of testing and the strategy that was developed. So when we were in the fall semester, we put together this multi-layered mitigation strategy, and testing was a part of it. The frequency of testing at that point was there was never any data anywhere of observed data that would actually say this is the right frequency. There's a whole range of things that were being done, from no surveillance testing whatsoever to twice a week. And there's other than models which use variables that you put in, or assumptions in how a disease is going to behave. Other than that, there was no data to really generate how often that should be done. So we chose a frequency of 2 weeks to be able to use that as a time frame where it's a reasonable expectation that you will actually eventually find most, if not all, of this people who are asymptomatic. And this was, though, a bit of a guess, just like everybody else took a guess on what they thought the right frequency would be to be able to make a difference. Now, there was a lot of attention early on about many papers that had been published, particularly one in JAMA. In fact, this one was published by our brand new CDC director, who is a WashU grad, Dr. Walensky. It was a very well done paper. It was a model that looked at what kind of measures you need to put in place and how much testing would play a role in it in college campuses. And their conclusion was that you would need to test twice a week. Now, that is what made the headlines, and everybody talks about that. But when you dig deep into the paper itself and you look at the assumptions that they used, they actually assumed that the reproduction rate for infections on campus would be 2.5 or 2.5. And when it's that high, you need the extra testing on top of all of those other measures to be able to contain outbreaks. And they even acknowledge that themselves, and other subsequent papers and studies that have looked at models that say, how often do you need to test? They all give the caveat that if it's this level of a reproduction number, or R, you need to test this much. But if your R is lower because of the mitigation efforts that you do, then that frequency of testing is not necessary. And so what we did just in the last couple of weeks is we looked at all of our data from the fall semester. Our reproduction number in our region never exceeded 1.4. And most of the time it was right around 1. And a big reason for that was because of all of the other layers of mitigation. When you think about what makes a difference in stopping transmission, first and foremost, it's masking, staying away from other people, and avoiding gatherings. And our students did such a great job of that in the fall semester that there wasn't our reproduction number wasn't high enough that extra testing would have made much of a difference. And so that's the reason why, after looking at actual data and after analyzing models and looking deep into the details of those papers that suggested more frequent testing, we feel very comfortable that at this point in time to continue with the same frequency. However, we also realize that and have the capacity to deploy testing for other situations. If there's a little cluster somewhere, we zoom in and actually then do some broader testing to try to nip it in the bud before it becomes a big cluster. And that approach led to a semester last time where we had no clusters over just a couple of 2 or 3 people, and no super spreading events.
Great, thank you. So the next question, Dr. Lawrence, I'm going to stay with you as well. Will WashU consider making the dashboard more comprehensive? Can you show the total number of daily tests and number of students in quarantine and isolation? And then one related follow-up from the chat, why not just publish the entry data as it comes in?
I wish we had our technical folks here. I think we had been planning to put the entry data in there as it was coming in, but I think there was just more of a dashboard technical issue with that. So I'm not 100% certain on that aspect of it. It is certainly nothing to hide, and it looks great, but we're certainly want to get it up there as quickly as possible. For the isolation and quarantine numbers, just to clarify, the column that says active cases, that actually is the number of students in isolation at any given time.
Thanks, Dr. Lawrence. Dr. LeBlanc, I'm going to bounce back to you on this one. What's the latest guidance on going into friends' homes if there are only 2 or 3 people present? Too risky? I've avoided it, but nobody else seems to be, LOL.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, at this moment, we know that about 1 in 200 people in St. Louis at this time are infected with COVID and might infect others. So basically, the more people that you hang out with, the higher the risk of exposure is. But remember, though, that is if you're hanging out unmasked and not physically distanced. So if you're craving an in-person experience, you can do that safely by staying masked and being at least 6 feet apart. So, don't go to crowded bars or restaurants and share meals, because then you're putting yourself at risk. But if you wanted to go into someone's home and everyone stayed masked and more than 6 feet apart, that's really a safe thing to do.
Dr. Lawrence, this one relates to classroom teaching. Why doesn't WashU start in-class teaching right away? Science shows students are not in danger of dying from COVID-19, and they're not getting much value online at all day long. So if masks work and they're around each other throughout the day anyway, why not go into the classroom wearing masks and learning in class?
Yeah, the decisions for any one individual class to be in person or not are made by individual instructors. We absolutely do know that we can devise classrooms to be safe. So those individual decisions are based sometimes on student preferences, sometimes on faculty preferences, sometimes the size of the course and whether or not there's a space for people to be physically distanced in each of those for each of those classes. But the other useful thing that has happened over the last 6 months, and we've seen it particularly in the K through 12 schools, but now also, we do have anecdotal data in university settings as well, that the person who did write that question is correct, that those settings can be, we can be safe. And so we, for example, had zero known cases of student illness due to transmission within a classroom setting, or for that matter, any university organized, either curricular or non-curricular university organized activities. We know of no student cases that have occurred that were transmitted during those settings.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Lawrence. It is 6:29. I see that we still have 221 people on the webinar, and we did talk beforehand about extending this a bit. So Dr. Lawrence and Dr. LeBlanc, if that's still okay, I'm going to go ahead and move through a few more questions. Great. Dr. Lawrence, the next one is a public health question, and it is around masking. Recently, it's been recommended to double mask. Are you recommending students double mask?
We are not recommending that at this time. And I will say that this is an ongoing story, and it's also a reaction to some, there are a couple things that are true, and so they sort of make sense, but again, we don't have data for it. So one of the things that has been driving this conversation that really just took off this week is because some of the new variants seem to be more transmissible. And so when you say, okay, I have something that's more transmissible, let's do something that will try to be more effective at stopping transmission. However, there's really no data, and we actually convened a group today with some of our environmental health and safety experts and another one of my infectious disease colleagues to look at what data have been published about mask use and effectiveness. And we haven't seen anything that wearing 2 masks would help with it. Now, it might make some common sense that might help. However, it's not that clear that that's the case, because depending on which kinds of masks are added together, it may actually affect the fit, which might even conversely make it less effective if it's not fitting very well. And so the other thing is that the real concern is having the right kind of mask and that it fits appropriately and it's worn appropriately. So one thing that we are doing, and we did review the mask guidance that we have for the university and ensured that, and we're going to make just a couple tiny little tweaks to it, but really, and also additional communications to show that we need, first off, the kind of material. The material needs to be, for a cloth mask, one where you can't really see light through it very easily. It needs to be at least 2 and preferably 3 layers, and it needs to be able to fit snugly and fit correctly. When those things are done, it is very unlikely that adding a second mask to that provides any benefit. And as I mentioned before, if it affects the fit of the the interior mask, it might actually do more harm than good. So this is something, though, that, again, just like everything else, we are monitoring this daily. And that's not even an exaggeration. I mean, there are Dr. LeBlanc and myself and several others on our COVID monitoring team. This is what we do all day, is really just look for new papers that come out and new data that is talking about the variants, masks, the vaccines, and side effects and efficacy. And so when there are new things that come out that demand a change in what we do, we'll do it.
Great. So the next question is somewhat related, and I think, Dr. Lawrence, it's a nice follow-up to the conversation we're having here. Why is it that we quarantine for 2 weeks? Even the CDC says 10 days.
Well, so the CDC doesn't say 10 days. So here's what the CDC says. The CDC says 14 days is the tried and true quarantine period that works. When you have scenarios where it's really, really hard to, or impossible to have community uptake and adherence to 14 days of quarantine, an alternative strategy of using 10 days can be done, but you take the risk of missing some positives that then are released from quarantine and still infectious. So these are situations that we, though, as a university, must abide by what our county and city health departments tell us to do. And so we have been, again, in just like with other topics, in conversation with them on a regular basis. And they have unequivocally told us that we cannot do that. And the CDC also very explicitly says that individual jurisdictions, the health departments, the local health departments, are the ones who can decide what is right for their community. I will say that the main reason why our health departments chose not to do that, and it was because of a very practical matter that, well, one, they're concerned about potential people slipping through. But the other one is another practical matter that one option meant that you could leave quarantine at 7 days, but it required a test. And we just simply didn't have enough testing and don't have enough testing for every person in quarantine to be tested at day 7, because then there would be no testing left for all the people who are symptomatic and who need to be tested to make an actual diagnosis. So that was a bit of a practical measure. Regardless, though, end result is that our health departments say, you can't do that. And so we can't do that.
Thanks. Dr. LeBlanc, I'm going to toss this one back to you. Are there any plans to provide outdoor activities or opportunities to gather this spring with an eye on students' mental health?
Thanks, Rebecca. Yes, is the short answer. We're very hopeful that is going to allow us, once the weather gets nicer, to do more outdoor activities. We all know that being outdoors, the activities there are safer than they are being indoors. And just as Steve is saying, we're really looking at our recommendations day by day, and fully hope and expect that as the weather gets warmer, we will be able to have our students enjoy that, though certainly today, as if anyone is here that's in St. Louis, it is not a nice day and there's snow on the ground. But yes, we do hope to do that as weather permits.
Great, thank you. Dr. Lawrence, this is about the long hauler issue. Dr. Fauci said among the young, otherwise healthy people who tested positive, long haulers account for more than 10% of the total. Some research indicates 20%. Among the WashU students, faculty, and staff who have tested positive, how many have become long haulers? How is the university supporting these individuals, especially if they can't return to normal work or study?
I think this will be a tag team answer, so I'll start. And the first thing is that this is actually a very problematic syndrome that seems to be recognized. It's a little bit early to really define long haul in the sense that we just haven't really had long-term studies since really people have only been infected since March and April of last year. Here's what we know about it so far, is that about 20% of all people who are infected still have symptoms after a month, and about 10% after 2 months. It tends to be more likely to have longer term symptoms for those who are older and those who are more severely ill. However, we do know that still some mildly ill people, including young individuals, I know some myself, who have been infected and then just feel lousy for months afterwards. We don't know at all, one, the mechanism of it in most cases. Sometimes there are some impacts that the virus has on the heart and the lungs. That's more rare, where there's actually, say, something that we call myocarditis in the heart or damage in the lungs that can occur. Can happen, and it's something that's being evaluated for people who do have those long-term symptoms. But in the majority of cases, you don't find that kind of damage. So the mechanisms by which people have these symptoms are not understood. Two, we also have no idea what the endpoint is on these, because again, the studies that have been published so far just look out to 3 months or so of follow-up. So do some of them last 6 months or a year or more? We just don't know. And so that's what we know about it. But I will defer to Dr. LeBlanc about what has been happening in our own experience with our own population.
Thanks. We have not had anyone so far where we would call them, quotes, a long hauler. The vast majority of our patients that really have had very few symptoms, very mild, or no symptoms at all. Though we absolutely encourage all of our students, even after they're feeling better, to remember to reach out to us. They know that we're available should they have any question. And I will also say we've had a few students who've had some increased fatigue or shortness of breath that we have sent along to our cardiology specialists at WashU who are really looking and doing their research on this. But locally right now, so far, I'm knocking some wood. We our students have had very few symptoms when associated with their illness.
That's good news. So I see that we're at 6:40 now. I have two questions, one from the chat that I'm going to cover, and then we'll conclude with some goodbyes. So the first one is, how long do you have to wait to get vaccinated if you have had COVID? Dr. Lawrence?
So we recommend about 3 months, and there's a couple reasons for this. One of them is that if you've had recent COVID and you get the vaccine, some of the side effects of the vaccine might be a little more extensive. And, the side effects from the vaccine are not serious in the respect, most of them are not serious in the respect that they're going to cause any long-term illness. But for some people who get the vaccine, and especially the second dose, it knocks you out for a day where you really can't work and do much of anything. So anybody who's going to be vaccinated, and hopefully everybody here will eventually be vaccinated, but if you're coming up anytime soon, keep this in mind. Don't schedule anything really important the day after you get vaccine. Trust me on this. Some of you will experience this, particularly the second dose. But the reason we say to wait 3 months afterwards also has to do with the fact that we're pretty confident that the vast majority of people who are infected have really good immunity and are there's almost zero chance that they're going to be reinfected in those 3 months. So it gives an opportunity, if you've been infected, to then say, you know what, I'm going to step back and let some other people get vaccinated ahead of me.
Right. And this is somewhat of a follow-up to that as well. I was previously told after contracting COVID and recovering, there is a window of 3 to 8 months after the infection where a person is likely to be immune from recontracting the illness. Is that the case when considering the new variants of coronavirus? If so, is it possible that the second infection could be more severe than the first?
Yeah. We don't know completely yet about the variants and the impact on reinfection. Here's the things that we do know. So most people, in fact, almost everybody will have complete immunity and not get reinfected within 3 months. Reinfection can occur, and the likelihood of that happening, the frequency of that happening, still not totally determined yet. But over the next 6 months after that is about as much follow-up data as we have from those early cases in the spring. There's a little bit of an increased risk that happens that people can be reinfected. But again, it seems to be pretty rare, not a common occurrence. So we infer from that people have solid immunity for 3 months and probably really good immunity for many months after that. But again, we don't know the endpoint. If it's based on other coronaviruses, we know that reinfection can occur. Generally speaking, reinfection is less severe. However, there have been a couple of case reports where a second infection is more severe. So I don't think we can say unequivocally that always, if you've been infected once, the second time will be milder. I think that's usually the case, but not always. The role that the new variants play, particularly the one that has been identified as the South African variant, there is some concern, but it's mostly theoretical at this point, that there will be an increased risk that those who had prior infection will be more likely to have reinfection with this new variant. So there is some evidence evolving that may be the case. But as far as how much more likely, or how much of a higher risk, again, there just aren't enough cases to know, and really only a handful of cases that are seen, in the U.S., but really even around the world, we just haven't got enough data to be able to make a conclusion on that yet.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to wrap it up tonight. Thank yous, Dr. LeBlanc and Dr. Lawrence, and thanks for all the attendees on the call. We are still over 200, and so that's absolutely fantastic that we're able to share all of this information out to our community. Be sure to keep an eye on the Danforth Campus Digest and our COVID-19 website to learn more about when our next Ask the Doctors Town Hall is going to take place. And also be sure to continue to check our FAQ. We continue to update that information there as we get new details to add. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and stay safe. Bye-bye.